German, Dutch, Chinese, and Hebrew. His books include Reclaiming Goodness, Education and the Spiritual Quest, University of Notre Dame Press, 2001, Ethics and Spirituality in Education, Philosophical, Theological, and Radical Perspectives, Sussex, 2004, Citizenship, Education, and Social Conflict, Israeli Political Education in Global Perspective, Routledge, 2011, and Muslim Character and Citizenship. So it's much, earlier. His new book, Reimagining Liberal Education, Affiliation and Inquiry in Democratic Schooling, will appear from Bloomsbury next year. So please join me to welcome Dr. Alexander.
So the thing about these introductions is we write them ourselves. Again, thank you to Dr. Aslan and the organizers of the conference for inviting me. It's not a foregone conclusion that a Jewish Israeli professor of philosophy of education would be invited to a conference on citizenship, education, and Islam. And when I received the invitation, I immediately said yes and put aside everything else in order to be able to be here because I think actually the presence of a person like myself, not necessarily me, in this conversation is extraordinarily important. And I hope that this is the beginning of continuing conversations. Among many other reasons, I have for a very long time been looking for Muslim colleagues that think like you guys do. And where I live, I don't find a lot of them. And we need to talk more with one another. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to divide my comments into 4 sections. I want to first say some general things about the problems of citizenship education in liberal democracies. Then I want to say a little bit about the case of Israel. I wasn't actually going to do this, but a number of people have asked me questions in the course of the last couple of days that have led me to think that it might be useful to say something about the Israeli case, so I will do so. Then I want to go back a little bit to the philosophical theory and talk about why we don't really have a good philosophical theory of citizenship education, which is why we're having such a hard time figuring out what it means in this conversation. And then I'll give a few examples of what I think a good theory might look like at the end. So I'm going to try and do that all in whatever 20, 25 minutes I have, and if I run out of time, I'll finish up in the questions that you ask me later. So in general, I want to use 2 very important distinctions in the literature, one on citizenship education and the other on political philosophy. The first from my late friend that Sibrin Medam had already commented upon, Terry McLaughlin, between maximal and minimal citizenship education. And the second by the well-known political philosopher Michael Walzer, between what he calls thick and thin moral theories. And I want to use these 2 distinctions in the following ways. In general, I would say that the problem that we're struggling with has to do with the tension between the common civic society that we all share in a democratic society, on the one hand, and particular religious, cultural, moral, linguistic, and other kinds of traditions, national, on the other. And those 2 are in tension one with another. Now, on classical liberal theory, the sort that was invented by Kant and followed through Locke and John Stuart Mill and John Rawls, classical, sometimes called comprehensive liberal theory, there's a neutral public square. And a bunch of people have talked about secular society and made some reference or another to the neutrality of that public square. But I think Professor Medema very, very effectively argued that the idea of that public square being neutral is in fact somewhat problematic. Those of us that are religious people don't necessarily see secularism as neutral, which is not to say that it's bad, it's not to say that it's good, it's just to say that it's other than the view that, say, I might hold, because I don't consider myself in particular to be a secularist, at least not in the strong sense of the term. So a secular society is not neutral, nor is the rationality that we might use upon which to justify such a society in liberal theory neutral. So I'm going to go forward with the assumption that neutrality is not going to be a useful way of talking, in which case the nature of that public square is problematic for us, because it's not something that we can come in and justify. Everybody that's rational is going to hold on to that public square, and I can talk at length about some of the problems with that view of rationality. So that we really have a tension between the commons, that which we share in common, and that which divides us, or that which we would be different. Some of the difference might be religious, some of it might be linguistic, some of it might be centered around nationality or culture. Could be there are gender differences. There might be differences of sexual orientation. There are lots of things that divide people in pluralistic societies, and the big problem of liberal democratic theory is to figure out how we can live together with all of that great difference. So in that context, McLaughlin makes a distinction between what he calls maximal citizenship education and minimal citizenship education. Put very simply, maximal citizenship education is a maximization of those kinds of values that make it easier for people that have different points of view to live together. So the more maximal approach to citizenship education is going to emphasize values like tolerance, like acceptance of difference, like respect for the other. It's going to emphasize pedagogies that involve debate or dialogue or discussion that might diminish the idea that there is some sort of absolute truth, and emphasize the idea that we have an opportunity to learn one from another. The maximal citizenship education is going to be more open in its orientation. A minimal approach to citizenship education these are not really dichotomous, they should be thought of sort of on a scale to the maximal end and to the minimal end. The minimal end is really just to talk about the mechanics of democracy. That is to say, in this country I have a parliament, in that country I have a Congress, in this country I have a Supreme Court, in that country I have some other kind of court, in this country I have a president, in this other country I have a monarchy, and so on and so forth. The basic mechanics that people need to know. And McLaughlin's argument is that citizenship education in a robust democratic state that chooses to be liberal is going to want to emphasize the more maximal points, because the minimal mechanics are just not enough to get a robust citizenship going. I think the wonderful examples that we saw here from Montenegro of all of the different problems, am I this or that or something else, what exactly am I, really just illustrate how important the maximal approach to citizenship education is. So the maximal idea then is the idea that maximizes those values that help us share life in common. Now, to be sure, those values are not neutral. Tolerance is not a neutral value. There are plenty of cultures around the world that want not to be tolerant. They think tolerance for views that are different than theirs is a bad thing. And I happen to disagree with those views. But that the idea that we would seek a maximal set of values that allow us to live together is a choice that we would make. I choose to make that choice because I like living together with people that are different than me. I think that democratic societies are important in that way. And I can give you a lot of reasons why I think that's a useful way of thinking. But I just want to point out that I don't come to the idea that the maximal position is right or is rational in its own case. It's a choice that we make. It's a choice that we make because we choose to live in a certain kind of society. The second distinction, the one that Michael Walzer makes, is in a way the reverse distinction. Walzer points out that actually this liberal idea that there's a set of values that we all share is a relatively thin idea. It's a kind of thin liberalism. Because actually that kind of liberalism, in a way, looks for values that are not necessarily deeply grounded in tradition and culture and history and belonging, the sorts of values that many of you in the course of the last day and a half have sought to ground in your own Islamic tradition, but rather is sort of lifted out of that context into some sort of almost arbitrary, contrived context in which there's this sort of thin layer of universality that we all share. the argument of that wonderful little book that it's actually called Thick and Thin, Moral Traditions at Home and Abroad. The argument of that book is that the rich life that we all live is actually the thick life, is grounded in concrete historical cultures with language and tradition, and yes, even religion, in a robust sort of way. So, in a way, what McLaughlin talks about as the maximal citizenship education is going to be the thin tradition of moral discussion that Michael Walzer talks about. And most of our moral lives, the lives that we live in which we think about who we are and what's good for us to do, that actually is going to be in the thicker, sort of more grounded, historical, cultural, deeply rooted kinds of traditions. Well, so in that sense, the problem of citizenship education that I want to say, and the problem I think that we've been struggling with over the last day and a half, is how do I put together a maximal citizenship education? That is to say, a maximal view of how we can live together across difference in a shared society on the one hand, with a thick conception of moral, religious, cultural tradition on the other. How do I put those two things together? I think that's the project that McLaughlin had on board. It's the project that I shared with him. He called it Openness with Roots. I call that project the Pedagogy of Difference. And the Pedagogy of Difference is something I want to say a little bit about at the very end of my talk. So the first part then is to create a conceptual philosophical frame in which I say that what I'm after here is a way of thinking about citizenship education that seeks to broaden the ways in which we can talk about life together across difference without minimalizing our fundamental differences, with allowing us to celebrate the ways in which we choose to celebrate our lives in our own cultural heritage, grounded in history, culture, language, religion, and so on. So that's sort of the challenge, and much of my own philosophical work is based on trying to sort of figure out how we might do that. Now I came to think about that, those two terms in particular, in part as part of my move to live in the state of Israel. So let me say a little bit about the Israeli case, because I think oftentimes there's a misconception in general about Judaism and about Israel for a whole host of reasons, and I've felt that misconception in a bunch of questions that people have asked me since I've been here. I think from the perspective of European society and Christian society, enlightened Europe, and probably also Islam, there's a tendency to view Judaism primarily as a religious tradition. Now it's true that Judaism does have a religious tradition. I myself am an adherent to that tradition, as you saw last night when I said the prayer for Shabbat, and I wore this funny hat on my head, and it says I was trained at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I'm actually an ordained rabbi. I'm a religious Jew. I believe in Jewish religion. But the fact is that historically Judaism actually has two pillars of identity and not one. One pillar of identity is religious, and the other pillar of identity is a form of political, cultural, national affiliation. The sort of confusing kind of thing that wonderful talk, I really liked your talk about Montenegro, because I identified with all of those. When the borders move and where exactly do I fit? Well, that's the sort of kind of cultural, political identity that's associated with Judaism as well. In the course of our history, we've gone back and forth between emphasizing different aspects of that identity. For the first 1,500, 2,000 years of Jewish existence, before the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in the year 70 of the Common Era, most of Jewish life was constructed around a form of political identity. It was a monarchy, first the monarchy of the Davidic kingship, then that society was destroyed through a bunch of socio-political, geopolitical forces. It was recreated when Cyrus allowed Jews to come back to Jerusalem in 444 before the Common Era. A temple there was rebuilt by Ezra the prophet and Nehemiah the political leader, and the Jews lived in the land of Israel for about 500 years until that political entity then broke up, and then the religious thing came in and redefined itself and became dominant in the way in which Jews lived under Christian and Muslim rule for close to almost 2,000 years. And then in the last 100 years, there's been a revival, an important revival of our political tradition in the form of political Zionism and the creation of the State of Israel. So I say this because it's important to understand that Israel as a political entity is a deep expression of the way in which Jews choose to define their Jewishness. I was born in the United States in a Zionist family, and I chose to move to Israel. It was a matter of my own political choice, because like most Jews around the world today, we view our identity primarily or first in political terms, and secondarily in religious terms. And that's something that's hard for people to get their head around, because for very long, people have viewed Jewish identity, including Jews, by the way, in other terms. That's a shift of the last 100 years or so. Many, many more Jews view themselves as Jews culturally and politically than they do religiously. Religion is something that divides Jews today, and cultural and political identity is I wouldn't say it exactly unites us. I don't know how united we really are, but if there's anything that it unites, it's more that. So that, from that point of view, the creation of a Jewish state in the land in which the culture and tradition of the Jewish people was created is not really very different than all of the other political entities that we're talking about. Austria, Turkey, Montenegro, Albania, with all of the complexities there pertaining with all of the rights and the non-rights and the disagreements and the conflicts and the should we have and the do we have, and are there other people that also claim rights to this land? In our case, everybody knows that the Jews aren't the only people that claim right to those lands. There's also Palestinians that claim similar rights, and we're in conflict over those rights. And in that respect, Israel, I like to say, is actually not the exception, it's the rule. We're more or less like everybody else in this particular regard, and that's sometimes hard to get our heads around as well. So in this respect, I do like to say this in general about Israel. There are a lot of people that have really high hopes for Israel for all sorts of messianic and pseudo-messianic reasons, Jews and non-Jews. And those of us that had messianic hopes have been really profoundly disappointed, because it's just not a perfect place. It's not. If you have utopian hopes about Israel, you're going to be really disappointed, because it's no use.